Okay, guys, today we're going to start with 5.3. We just finished going through 5.1 and 5.2. 5.3 is picking up after the Spanish American War, leading up into World War II. So we're going to start with 5.3 and we're going to look at some of the important things from 5.3. We're going to start with discussing what 5.3 is, and it's about policy and diplomacy after the Spanish American War. So, after the war is over with, there's going to be a shift in American policy. The U.S. became very assertive in Asia and in Latin America, which we sort of discussed in the last standard when we were talking about Cuba. We were getting into that, and of course, the Philippines and what was going on in those places. But now we're going to look at it in a little more detail. Control of the Pacific Islands set the U.S. eyes on trade with China, and we discussed that as well. Remember, the reason why the United States wanted to become an imperialist power mainly was because of economic reasons and getting close to China. So China would open up trade. The United States would definitely benefit from having trade with China, and that was going to be a big deal, especially in the Pacific. The United States wanted to create a sphere of influence, meaning that they would have influence in that area, and having these new lands because of imperialism would be a way to make sure that that happened. The U.S. is going to move from the idea of isolationism to the idea of imperialism. Remember, we said this in the last standard, how the United States was an isolationist country before the Spanish American War, but after the Spanish American War, they become more imperialistic. So they're moving from sort of keeping to themselves to moving outward and beyond. And so that's what we see after the Spanish American War. Speaking of China, let's talk about what goes on there during this period. Again, the United States wanted a sphere of influence, special trade privileges in that area, mainly with China. These spheres of influence, of course, would definitely benefit the United States economically as well as militarily. The U.S. didn't have one in China, so again, they wanted to try to create one. They were going to do this through something known as the open door policy, and we're going to get into this a little bit. The U.S. asked for equal opportunity to trade within other spheres, trade outside of the United States, to go into other places in Latin America and in Asia and in Europe and other places. So the open door policy was going to be the way that they were going to create these spheres. Again, this would economically benefit the United States if they opened up trade with China. It's going to help because they're going to be able to get a lot of things from China, bring them back to the United States, and make money with them. And then, of course, they were hoping that China would also buy goods from the United States. So it would open up a huge market for the U.S. And this was the policy that was going to be used, the open door policy with China. Again, this is showing you a picture how the Philippines were simply stepping stones to China, needing the Philippines to help create that sphere of influence in China. And of course, you can see in the map how there are other countries that are involved trying to get a sphere of influence in China as well: the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and so on. So those countries are also playing a major role in trying to create a sphere of influence in China and open up trade with China. Now, because of all of the foreign interference that was going on in this area and in China, eventually there's going to be problems. The Chinese are going to start to resent the idea that other countries are trying to come into their country and change them. A group known as the Boxers, which were actually Chinese nationalists, and of course you should know what the word nationalist means at this point, are going to rebel against the foreigners that were in China. They were mainly upset that the Chinese or that the foreigners were actually trying to change their culture. A lot of them did not want that. And of course, they're going to rebel. And this is going to lead to the Boxer Rebellion, which will go on from 1898 to 1901. What the Boxer Rebellion was anti-foreign, meaning they wanted the foreigners out. They wanted to go back to just being concerned with China, not dealing with these foreign countries, more isolationist. But it was a pro-nationalist movement in China. They opposed foreign imperialism, which we know that these other countries have been going in, and they also opposed the idea of Christianity. Christianity, of course, the main religion of a lot of the European countries as well as the United States, and they were trying to spread Christianity. Remember, that was one of those motivations for imperialism. The U.S. took a leading role to end this rebellion, which is actually going to make China even more upset that the United States is trying to get involved in their business. Again, here's a picture showing all the European countries and other countries battling over China during the Boxer Rebellion. But while the Boxer Rebellion was going on, we still didn't lose focus on what was going on in Latin America. Remember how we said that Cuba and the Platt Amendment and Teller Amendment and those things were going on? We're going to look at some other things too that were also occurring in this area. Remember with Cuba, we discussed this in the last indicator. The Platt Amendment, remember the Platt Amendment came in after the Teller Amendment. The Platt Amendment pretty much said that the United States would have some supervision over Cuban affairs, and the United States would also get a military base, which ends up being Guantanamo Bay, also referred to as Gitmo. We still have Guantanamo Bay even to this day. So the Platt Amendment does play a major role in Cuba for a period of time. Panama becomes an issue too. Of course, the only way that you could get from New York City to San Francisco or to any Western Coast city would be to travel all the way around South America. So there was a push to build a canal that would actually link the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And Panama was the most likely place where this canal could be built. It's the shortest route. And so Panama became a focus after the Spanish-American War. U.S. saw a lot of value to Panama's location, its geographic location, would shorten that trip from 13,000 miles to almost 5,000 miles, which is a big difference for sure. The United States is going to offer to buy Panama from Colombia, who controlled Panama at that point. The Colombians are going to refuse. Once they refuse, the United States comes up with another plan. The plan was to support a revolution in Panama to overthrow the Colombian government that was in control of Panama. The United States would send battleships actually to station off the coast to make sure the Colombians did not try to respond while the revolution was going on. And the Panamanians are going to get their independence from Colombia, and the United States is going to proceed forward with purchasing the land to build the canal. Again, here's a picture of construction during the canal being built. The U.S. is going to obtain exclusive rights to build the canal from the new Panamanian government, and construction would begin. It was mainly built by the Panamanians. Theodore Roosevelt's going to play a major role in that. It was a big undertaking because you had to deal with so much elevation and mountains and jungles and swamps. A lot of men died actually building the canal. So it was a huge undertaking to actually make this project go through. The Panamanians, though, come to resent the United States because of their workers and people being there constantly. They still wanted their own independence. So a lot of Panamanians were not happy about the United States being there while the canal was being built. Again, this is showing a picture of McKinley helping build the canal and standing over most of Central America. He's got 1 foot in the United States, 1 foot in Central America, showing you how the United States was sort of exerting its control over those areas. Again, here's another political cartoon showing Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "I don't always dig holes, but when I do, they connect oceans," of course referring to the Panama Canal. Speaking of Theodore Roosevelt, he's going to have a type of diplomacy that he's going to use. If you don't know what diplomacy is, it's really about dealing with other countries. And he's going to use a different tactic. His tactic is going to be called the big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt, when he becomes president, is going to issue something called the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, we had talked about the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine basically said that all European countries were not going to be allowed to colonize anymore in our hemisphere. And the Roosevelt Corollary just pretty much takes it one step further. Roosevelt viewed the United States as being the world policeman, that we should help be the policeman of the entire world, that if things are going wrong, then we should be able to go in there and settle those problems. Again, he wants to keep European powers out of Central America and Latin America. He didn't want to have to deal with fighting a European power in those areas. And he's telling the Europeans, once again, that you're not welcomed in Latin America. But we also are going to intervene to make sure that this doesn't happen. Big stick diplomacy was Roosevelt's quote, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." You don't have to be the loudest in the world, but as long as you got the military to back it up, that's pretty much what that means. The U.S. is going to intervene quite frequently in Central America. In fact, to actually even keep European countries from moving in, a lot of these countries owed money to European countries. So to prevent the Europeans from sending over a military force to attack to try to get some of that money, the United States even steps into those countries, took over the custom houses in those countries, and actually collected the taxes for those European countries just to make sure that the Europeans did not come into Central America. We talked about this in the last indicator when we talked about Theodore Roosevelt building the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was a series of battleships that were built during this period that Theodore Roosevelt sent on a world tour just to show the power of the United States and how we could go anywhere in the world and intervene if we had to. So the Great White Fleet played a major role in big stick diplomacy. Again, the Great White Fleet is going to show off our U.S. naval superiority. Again, a couple of pictures, political cartoons from that period. Of course, you see Roosevelt with the big stick. You see there, he's holding it, sitting on the country of Panama. And again, you see him as being portrayed as the world policeman there with his, of course, his stick. The new diplomacy is written on it. And of course, it shows him holding off the Colombians and other places and holding off the European powers from actually moving into Central America there in that one cartoon. And of course, using the Monroe Doctrine in his favor as well as the Roosevelt Corollary. The other diplomacy that was used was called dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy wasn't very successful. We're going to talk about why. President Taft was the one who issued it. Dollar diplomacy is the promise to protect American investments in Latin America. It guaranteed that all U.S. loans, that if we owned a dollar to them, that money would be paid back. Promised that the United States would intervene if any problems arose in those countries. Basically, they're paying for protection from the United States. We also had another type of diplomacy that was used called moral diplomacy. Moral diplomacy was started by President Wilson. Moral diplomacy, basically looking at countries that were similar to us, who had the same moral beliefs. Those moral beliefs, if they were similar to the United States, then we were more than likely willing to help out. We would support the nations that were like us, who supported that were democratic. We would use that money to give to those democratic nations, just simply because their government and our government were similar. And economically, it hurt all the other countries that were non-democratic. So moral diplomacy was what was used by President Wilson. Make sure you understand who used moral diplomacy, who used dollar diplomacy, and of course know Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Again, here's showing you some of the things that were done during this period. Of course, the Platt Amendments mentioned. We sent troops into the Dominican Republic in 1905. There was a blockade of Venezuela by the Germans and the United States during that period. We pushed through legislation in the 1900s in Nicaragua, and we sponsored revolution in Panama in 1903. So all of these were things that were done during this period, showing the United States was intervening in Central America. That's going to be the end of 5.3. We'll pick up with 5.4 later on. A couple of things, again, that you really need to focus on. Make sure you know all those diplomatic things that were done. Make sure you know what the Platt Amendment was. Know which president actually did some of those different types of diplomacy. How the United States intervened in Cuba, how the United States played a major role in trying to open up trade with China through that open door policy. So please make sure you're familiar with those things. And if you do that, you should be good to go for our next quiz. And that should do it. Okay, I'll talk to you guys later.